The desert held its breath as Ash Mesa slept under a moon like a chipped coin. Cole Mercer said tonight, "I pay what I owe." A coyote yipped, and the wind folded it into silence. Sheriff Harlan Pike said, "Men like you always come back to the rope." The church bell tolled once, as if it had miscounted the sins in town. Lark Finch said, "You sure about this, Cole?" "Cole Mercer said a man gets sure when running stops working." Roosevelt said, "Turn back before the gallows turns you." The street smelled of dry wood and gun oil, and shadows leaned like drunks. Old Tom Avery said, "Law breaks men, same as men break law." A window flared with lamplight, and then died, and the town exhaled dust. Sheriff Harlan Pike said, "Lay down the iron and kneel to the badge." Cole Mercer said, "Your badge is tin over rot." There's gunshot cracked the night like glass, and a horse screamed far down the arroyo. Lark Finch said, "Cole, he's baiting you to draw in the open." Roosevelt said, "He owns the street and the judge and the rumor." Old Tom Avery said, "Pick your ground, boy, not your grave." Cole Mercer said, "I pick the truth, even if it bleeds." The bell tolled twice this time, and Ash Mesa finally woke. Dawn found the town salted with ash light, and the blood had already dried to the color of rust. Cole Mercer said, "One shot, and every sin woke up." Lark Finch said, "They will say you fired first." Cole Mercer said, "They always do." The church bell hung quiet now, as if it had grown ashamed of counting. Roosevelt said, "Pike will make a show of mercy and sell you to a rope." Old Tom Avery said, "You stand on boards that know too many last steps." Cole remembered a farmhouse burned low, and a grave marked by a tin cup. Cole Mercer said, "I came for the man who took my brother's name and sold it to the law." Lark Finch said, "Then we need proof that breathes longer than rumor." Roosevelt said, "Proof costs more than bullets and pays back slower." Cole felt the town watching from behind lace and slats. Old Tom Avery said, "Every truth starts a fire, and this place is tinder." Cole Mercer said, "Then strike the match where Pike cannot stamp it out." The sun tilted up and found their faces, and the day began its slow trial. They met behind the livery where the smell of hay and iron drowned the whispers. Old Tom Avery said, "Pike's ledgers live in the courthouse like fat spiders." Lark Finch said, "Ledgers do not shoot back, men do." Cole Mercer said, "I am tired of dying by inches." Roosevelt said, "Courthouse doors open to money and shut on hope." Old Tom Avery said, "There is a back window that sweats in heat, and today it will sweat." Lark Finch said, "You trust her, Cole?" Cole Mercer said, "Trust is a coat you wear until it rips." Roosevelt said, "I know the clerk who writes lies like hymns." The Appaloosa snorted, tapping a hoof like a judge. Old Tom Avery said, "Take the pages that prove Pike sold warrants like cattle." Cole Mercer said, "Then the town can weigh truth against fear." Lark Finch said, "Fear is heavier in a rope town." Roosevelt said, "Heavier still when the law lifts it." The plan hung between them like a lantern with too little oil. The courthouse breathed cool like a stone well, and every footstep sounded guilty. Cole Mercer said, "Walk slow and look like you belong." Lark Finch said, "I do not even belong in my boots." Roosevelt said, "The clerk loves flattery more than food." Old Tom Avery said, "He loves Pike's coin most of all." The clerk glanced up and saw only faces he planned to forget. Cole Mercer said, "I need records on cattle permits," and the words were a clean shirt. Roosevelt said, "Your pen makes miracles, sir," and she smiled like a soft knife. Lark Finch said, "Ink smells like rain," and the clerk relaxed. Old Tom Avery said, "Windows cracked, hinge sings, draft comes from the alley." Cole Mercer said, "Lark, breathe. Then move when the bell rings once." The clerk fussed with stamps, and Rosa slid a key across like passing sugar. Lark Finch said, "Now," and the hinge sang. They found a drawer with names that did not fit their owners. Deputy boots drummed the corridor like rain on tin, and the air grew thin. Cole Mercer said, we leave with what we came for. Lark Finch said, my hands are louder than thunder. Rosa Vale said, fold the pages inside your vest and keep your heart slow. Old Tom Avery said, Pike's shadow reaches before he does. The clerk finally looked up and saw the wrong story on their faces. Cole Mercer said, Sir, thank you for your service, and shut the drawer with a soft click. The bell outside tolled once, and Lark moved like a letter sliding under a door. Rosa Vale said, smile at the deputy like you owe him money. Old Tom Avery said, do not blink while passing the badge. They stepped into sunlight, and the town stared as if it could read through cloth. Cole Mercer said, we have proof that breathes. Lark Finch said, then we learn if truth carries a gun. Rosa Vale said, Pike will load it for you. The pages rustled like dry leaves that knew fire was coming. The morning bled slow into Ash Mesa, and left the sky raw at the edges. Cole Mercer said, every road I took led back to this street. Wind combed ash from the eaves, and laid it across his boots. He remembered a farmhouse crushed by flame and a tin cup on a grave. Cole Mercer said, I kept walking so the ghosts had to chase. The bell rope hung quiet, as a vow someone feared to speak. He felt his brother's voice like grit behind his teeth. Cole Mercer said, Pike sold my name and called it order. A dog barked once, and crawled under a wagon like a truth in hiding. Cole studied his hands, and found powder stains older than sleep. Cole Mercer said, I want justice even if it wears my face thin. A door creaked, and the town looked away like a practiced sin. Cole Mercer said, if I fail here, I fail forever. Sunlight climbed the steeple, and made a small, hard crown. They sat behind the smithy, where heat from the forge softened the chill. Lark Finch said, tell me how to stop shaking. Cole Mercer said, you learn to hold the shake until it holds you. The boy's grin tried and failed, then tried again. Lark Finch said, they will call us thieves of paper. Cole Mercer said, let them call us names till truth drowns them. The ledgers lay flat, breathing like animals caged by ink. Lark Finch said, I saw the rope in Pike's smile. Cole Mercer said, smiles hide more knives than belts do. A hammer rang inside, and time flinched with each blow. Lark Finch said, was your brother as brave as they say? Cole Mercer said, he was kind, and that cost him most. Lark Finch said, then I will learn the price and pay it. Cole Mercer said, only pay what leaves you human. The wind carried coal smoke that smelled like a coming storm. Rosa Vale waited at the saloon balcony where shade cut the sun into ribbons. Rosa Vale said, clerks talk when they are thirsty and safe. Cole Mercer said, which will you sell them first? Her smile flickered like a match that chose not to light. Rosa Vale said, I sell chances, not fates. The street below carried rumors like dry leaves. Cole Mercer said, you knew the drawer with other men's names. Rosa Vale said, I knew the music of its lock, and who danced to it. A rider crossed the square and stared too long at their shadows. Rosa Vale said, Pike thinks mercy is a leash he can rent. Cole Mercer said, I think you carry 2 keys and one is for me. She looked away and swallowed a memory that tried to bite. Rosa Vale said, do not love truth so much you forget living. Cole Mercer said, I plan to live after it speaks. The balcony boards creaked under choices. Sheriff Harlan Pike stood outside the courthouse like a verdict with boots. Sheriff Harlan Pike said, you always bring weather when you arrive, Mercer. Cole Mercer said, weather washes things that need washing. Pike adjusted his gloves as if truth were a crease to smooth. Sheriff Harlan Pike said, surrender the pages, and I will spare your seconds. Cole Mercer said, your mercy is a door that shuts from the inside. A deputy shifted and made the boards complain. Sheriff Harlan Pike said, men forget that order is a kindness until night falls. Cole Mercer said, night fell when you sold justice by the pound. Pike's eyes took measure like a butcher choosing cuts. Sheriff Harlan Pike said, I will weigh you last so you can watch. Cole Mercer said, then bring a scale that does not lie. The town square held its breath and counted, none of them friends. Old Tom Avery poured coffee that tasted like iron and miles. Old Tom Avery said, I taught men to shoot straighter than they could sleep. Cole Mercer said, then teach me how to carry the weight after. The old man's eyes held storms that forgot where to land. Old Tom Avery said, killing is a road that never ends, only turns. Cole Mercer said, I want an end even if I crawl to it. The tin cup clicked against the table like a small hammer. Old Tom Avery said, your brother believed badges could be polished clean. Cole Mercer said, Pike turned his into a coin. Old Tom Avery said, coins buy moments, not peace. Ash from the stove drifted like tired snow. Old Tom Avery said, stand where truth can see you and shoot only its shadow. Cole Mercer said, then I will aim at the price, not the man. The old man nodded, and the room breathed again. The courthouse smelled of ink and fear, while townsfolk lined the hall like fence posts. Sheriff Harlan Pike said, order is a blanket, and I decide who sleeps warm. A rancher slid coins that clinked like small confessions. Cole Mercer said, he prices mercy by the ounce. The clerk wrote names that did not match faces and never looked up. Sheriff Harlan Pike said, sign here to unburden your soul and your purse. Old Tom Avery said, he is laundering guilt with receipts. Rosa Vale said, he smiles for the pews and bites in the alleys. Pike stamped papers like bullets, neat and numbered. Sheriff Harlan Pike said, this town runs on ledgers and graves. Cole Mercer said, then I will balance one with the other. The crowd shifted, hungry for someone else's trouble. Lark Finch said, they believe him because he speaks without shaking. Cole Mercer said, truth shakes after it stands. The hammer of Pike's seal fell again and echoed like a practiced sermon. Lark Finch carried the copied pages under his vest like a second, faster heart. Lark Finch said, if I keep walking I stay alive. The alley narrowed until even shadows scraped their shoulders. A deputy stepped from a doorway and wore the badge like a trap. Deputy, said Boy, you lost or just stupid? Lark Finch said, I am delivering laundry lists. The deputy's grin folded sharp and mean. Another pair of boots stitched the exit closed. Lark Finch said, Cole taught me to breathe and count. He reached 3, and the first fist arrived like a note due. Old Tom Avery said once, pain is a teacher who speaks clear. Lark Finch said, I will pass or I will bleed the lesson. He fainted left and met iron to the ribs. The pages crinkled loud enough to betray him. The alley swallowed his shout and saved it for later. Cole hit the alley like thunder, trying to learn restraint and failing. Cole Mercer said, step away from the boy. The first deputy raised his lip and met the wall before his breath did. Cole's revolver kissed daylight and argued with bone. Lark Finch said, I had them counted, just not named. Cole Mercer said, you kept breathing, that counts most. The second deputy reached for iron and found knuckles instead. Rosa Vale said, you are writing a louder story than proof can carry. Cole Mercer said, noise makes space for truth to walk through. Blood pooled in dust like black ink spread thin. Lark Finch said, I am sorry for the pages. Cole Mercer said, paper heals faster than boys do. The alley let out the shout it had saved, and doors cracked in fear. Cole holstered slow, as if the gun might bite again. They slipped into the saloon's back room where light behaved like a secret. Rosa Vale said, Pike plans a raid that looks like charity. Cole Mercer said, charity that steals before it gives. She touched the ledger copies, and then her throat, as if measuring a price. Rosa Vale said, there is a warrant with your brother's name folded inside it. Cole Mercer said, he is dead, and so is the lie. Rosa Vale said, Pike sells ghosts because they never testify. Lark Finch said, why tell us and not sell us? Rosa Vale said, because I am tired of being one more decorated key. Her eyes held water and burned it away. Cole Mercer said, choose before the gallows chooses you. Rosa Vale said, I already chose and it will hurt. The hallway creaked with a patient listener. Rosa Vale said, leave by the kitchen and keep the kitchen smells. Pike addressed the town from the boardwalk, as if blessing a harvest. Sheriff Harlan Pike said, there will be amnesty for the obedient and gallows for the rest. A cheer rose from men who feared silence. Cole Mercer said, he seeds dread and calls it grain. Deputies nailed fresh notices where hope once hung. Sheriff Harlan Pike said, curfew tempers sin and keeps widows safe. Old Tom Avery said, curfew fattens wolves that wear boots. Rosa Vale watched from the balcony and did not wave. Lark Finch said, he is building a fence around the truth. Cole Mercer said, then we kick where boards are weakest. Pike's gaze swept the street and paused on stories that tried to hide. Sheriff Harlan Pike said, bring Mercer by dusk and I forget his debt. Cole Mercer said, by dusk, the debt speaks for me. The town shivered like metal cooling too fast. The freight yard smelled of creosote and lies, and cranes drew crosses on the dusk. Cole Mercer said, we meet the clerk here and end the ledger's hunger. Lark Finch said, he promised names that bite Pike. Rosa Vale said, promises bite their owners first. The clerk stepped from between boxcars with sweat that did not match the cold. Clerk said, Mercer, I brought you daylight. Rifles answered from the dark and counted 3. Cole Mercer said, your daylight is a grave with windows. The clerk flinched as a deputy's badge flashed like a small moon. Ah. Sheriff Harlan Pike said, consider this an exchange of debts. Old Tom Avery said, back to the piles and hold left steel. Lark fired early and the night cracked like fired pottery. Cole Mercer said, smoke the rails and break their eyes. The clerk ran and left a ribbon of fear behind him. Rosa Vale said, your friend just sold you twice and kept the change. They fell backward through splinters while the yard wrote sparks in the wind. The saloon pitched with noise as if the piano had learned to shout. Lark Finch said, he is here, I swear it, and storm blew in with him. Cole Mercer said, we move quiet or not at all. Lark shouldered through gamblers like a colt in rain. Rosa Vale said, the man you chase is bait with boots. A deputy tilted his hat and pushed his luck across the table. Deputy said, boy, you lost your leash. Lark Finch said, I found my teeth, and flipped the table into the band. Glass broke and made a short starlight. Cole Mercer said, we cannot buy proof with broken mirrors. Old Tom Avery said, sleep this storm before it sleeps you. Shots slapped the ceiling and dust showered down like old sin. Lark's eyes packed regret but threw it too late. Cole dragged him toward the back door while the house reached for iron. They hid in a tanner's shed where hides hung like quiet verdicts. Old Tom Avery said, time to pay me back in truth. Cole Mercer said, name the debt and I will wear it. Old Tom Avery said, I trained Pike when his hands were still honest. The words struck like hoof iron on bone. Old Tom Avery said, I taught him to shoot center and talk sideways. Cole Mercer said my brother died because a sideways talker sold him. Old Tom Avery said I vouched for Pike to a judge who wore my whiskey. The shed swallowed the shame and gave back breath. Old Tom Avery said, I cannot lift what I nailed down, but I can swing beside you. Cole Mercer said, then you stand where the bullets argue. Old Tom Avery said, I stood there long before your boots were leather. Lark Finch said, teach me the part that keeps a man human. The old man nodded and loaded the silence with purpose. Rosa Vale met Cole in the churchyard where frost bit stone like small teeth. Rosa Vale said, I have 2 masters and one will bury me. Cole Mercer said, Pick the grave you can live with. She lifted a locket that caught the moon and showed Pike's seal hidden inside. Roosevelt said, he owns my debt, my passage, and my name from before. Cole Mercer said, names can be stolen but not kept. Roosevelt said, he saved me once so he could spend me forever. Wind scraped the bell, and it answered like a tired judge. Roosevelt said, I carried messages that placed men where ropes waited. Cole Mercer said, you can place one last message the other way. She pressed the locket into his palm and burned it shut with her stare. Roosevelt said, there is a meeting at dawn behind the assay office. Cole Mercer said, then dawn will see us both. She breathed like someone learning a new language and left. Dawn crawled in pale and found the town dressed for punishment. Notices screamed on posts where dances used to live. Sheriff Harlan Pike said, by decree, 5 ranch hands confessed to last night's riot. Their faces were names pulled from a hat he owned. Cole Mercer said, he frames the weak to straighten his posture. Lark Finch said, those boys were home counting blisters. Sheriff Harlan Pike said, Mercer, trade yourself for their pardon. Old Tom Avery said, pardons minted by liars tarnish fast. Roosevelt stood apart and watched guilt choose a dress. Cole Mercer said, release them, and weigh me after proof is heard. Sheriff Harlan Pike said, proof is whatever I pin to the door. Deputies hauled the men like sacks that argued. The square filled with fear that pretended to be order. Cole felt the clock in his chest call noon early. They met behind the assay office where Dawn made silver out of breath. Roosevelt said, I have one name left, and it is the one I ran from. Cole Mercer said, say it, and be done with running. She opened the locket, and a small crest stared like a cold eye. Roosevelt said, I am Rosa Hollis, daughter to Judge Asa Hollis. Lark Finch said, Pike bends his knee to your blood. Roosevelt said, he bends for coin and leash, never for love. Old Tom Avery said, Hollis weighs men and spends them by the pound. Roosevelt said, Pike keeps my debts and the judge keeps my past. Cole Mercer said, then both hold the rope. She handed Cole a folded letter, thick with ink and threat. Roosevelt said, this orders Pike to sell warrants in your name. Cole Mercer said, my brother died under that order. Roosevelt said it bought water rights and burned mercy. The sun lifted and made her tears look like grit. Hoofbeats drummed the square as a carriage black as a sealed verdict arrived. Judge Asa Hollis said, Sheriff, your tenure offends arithmetic. Sheriff Harlan Pike said, I kept your ledgers fat and your nights quiet. Judge Asa Hollis said, you kept them noisy with witnesses. The deputies stiffened like fence posts cut too short. Judge Asa Hollis said by circuit authority, you are relieved and replaceable. Sheriff Harlan Pike said, you cannot cut the hand that feeds your fear. The judge's men unrolled papers that smelled of iron and rain. Cole Mercer said, snakes eat snakes when meat runs thin. Roosevelt said, he means to bury Pike and salt the ground. Lark Finch said, then truth gets no grave marker. Sheriff Harlan Pike said, I taught this town to fear the dark. Judge Asa Hollis said, and I will sell it candles. The crowd watched power change hats without changing faces. In the church vestry, dust lay thick like words left unsaid. Cole Mercer said, read me the part that kills slow. Roosevelt said, Hollis ordered seizure of your creek after the fire. Lark Finch said, the fire he paid for. Roosevelt said, Pike forged the warrant with your brother's name to mask the theft. Cole Mercer said, my fight was never with one badge. The pages listed parcels like cattle, and mercy priced like salt. Cole saw the farmhouse again, and the tin cup that could not hold rain. Cole Mercer said, Hollis wrote the season, and Pike reaped it. Roosevelt said, there is a ledger page stamped for today. Lark Finch said, "They will move water by dusk." Cole Mercer said, "Then the river will speak before the court does." Bells outside rang practice notes for judgment. Cole folded the proof and felt his mission bend toward the courthouse steps. The creek ran thin where men had dammed it with lies and boards. Lark Finch said, "I will pull the gate while they watch you argue." Cole Mercer said, "You are not bait. You are a boy." Lark Finch said, "I am a man when the water moves." He slid down the embankment with a prayer that had no words. Two of Hollis's guards raised rifles like questions that expected yes. Lark Finch said, "Tell Pike I learned to stand." He yanked the pin, and the creek leapt like a freed animal. Shots cracked and chewed the bank beside him. Cole Mercer said, "Hold low and run crooked." Water battered the boards as if it had waited for this hour. Lark Finch said, "If I fall, write me simple." Cole Mercer said, "Live and write your own lines." The gate groaned and the valley drank. Evening settled in Old Tom's shack like a sentence served without appeal. Old Tom Avery said, "There is a truth I kept beneath my tongue." Cole Mercer said, "Spit it before it poisons both of us." Old Tom Avery said, "Years ago I rode on a night writ Hollis signed." He looked at his hands as if they were borrowed guns. Old Tom Avery said, "We burned a house we were told hid killers." Cole Mercer said, "That house held my brother and the last of our mother's quilts." Old Tom Avery said, "I fired at shadows that were not men." The stove clicked, loud and lonely. Old Tom Avery said, "I carved the road that carried Pike to power." Cole Mercer said, "You stand with me until the road ends." Old Tom Avery said, "I will stand, and I will fall if it buys your truth." The old man finally breathed like someone opening a door. Ash Mesa cracked open at noon and spilled rage into the street. Sheriff Harlan Pike said, "Curfew now, or coffins later." Deputies swept doors like a brush fire. Cole Mercer said, "Hold your ground and hold your tongues." Lark Finch said, "If they search me, they find the pages." Cole Mercer said, "Then they will learn to read the hard way." Roosevelt said Hollis posted more men at the square. Old Tom Avery said, "Men who lean on fear tip quick." A ranch wife cried as a deputy tore the notice from her hands. Cole Mercer said, "We show proof under the bell where lies ring loud." Sheriff Harlan Pike said, "Bring me Mercer and I forget your names." The crowd shrank and then swelled like a lung learning to live. Lark Finch said, "If we run, the truth dies behind us." Cole Mercer said, "We walk to the steeple and do not blink." Old Tom Avery said, "Keep the wind at your back and your shame in front." The town started walking, and the dust walked with it. Roosevelt said, "Then let the bell hear us first." They reached the churchyard and found the cold shade honest. Roosevelt said, "Hollis ordered Pike to bury you and bill him later." Cole Mercer said, "Then they will split my grave in halves." Roosevelt's hands shook and then learned stillness. Roosevelt said, "I sent the clerk west with a copy and my name." Lark Finch said, "You burned your bridge while standing on it." Roosevelt said, "I am done being the toll." Cole Mercer said, "You choose light or burn in it." Roosevelt said, "I choose to live inside the truth, even if it fits like wire." Old Tom Avery said, "She has sharper courage than both of us." The bell rope stirred without wind like a witness clearing its throat. Sheriff Harlan Pike said, "Leave that yard, Mercer, or I pull it down on you." Cole Mercer said, "Come try and learn what it costs." Roosevelt stepped forward and raised the letter in the sun. The town leaned closer as if the words had a flavor. Thus shot, found the fence, and chewed iron. Lark Finch said, "I will draw them off the pages." Cole Mercer said, "You are not a lure, you are a witness." Lark Finch said, "Witnesses drown if no one sees." He ran along the graves and turned once to grin at fear. A deputy fired and took the grin's coat instead. Roosevelt said, "Lark, keep low and twist left." Old Tom Avery said, boy, break their aim with your breath. Lark slid behind a headstone and fed the street a decoy scrap. Deputies rushed the wrong wind and tripped on their hunger. Lark Finch said, "Cole, the gate." Cole Mercer said, "2 steps, then drop." They moved like a lesson that finally made sense. Lark reached the steps and caught a bullet in the shoulder. Lark Finch said, "I am still here." Cole Mercer said, "Then the truth is, too." The bell shook once, as if it knew his name. The square emptied its fear into a circle and waited for thunder. Sheriff Harlan Pike said, "High noon, Mercer, and low odds." Cole Mercer said, "I like my odds when the sun sees everything." Pike's coat barely moved, but his eyes did. Old Tom Avery said, "Sight small, break the trigger like glass." Rosa Vale said, "End it with proof, not only lead." Cole Mercer said, "I will end it with both if I must." The clock above the bank coughed 12 and swallowed. Sheriff Harlan Pike said, "Draw," and joined the ledger. Cole Mercer said, "I am here to close it." Hands fell, and iron spoke. Dust leapt and stalled mid-air like a held breath. Pike's first round shaved Cole's hat and pride. Cole's reply bit wood near Pike's boot, and made him shift wrong. Old Tom Avery said, "Now, boy." Cole stepped left, and let the sun strike Pike's eyes. The third shot changed the day's name. Pike staggered and showed the town the man under the badge. Sheriff Harlan Pike said, "Hollis made me, and he will unmake you." Cole Mercer said, "He made coffins and called them contracts." Pike lurched toward a deputy and used him for shade. Rosa Vale said, "Read them the line that sells the dead for water." Cole Mercer said, "Article 4, signatures forged and mercy priced." The crowd murmured like a river that just woke. Judge Asa Hollis said, "Seize that paper and arrest the insolent." Old Tom Avery said, "Arrest this," and fired to break Hollis's order in half. Pike raised his gun toward Rosa and found Cole already there. Cole Mercer said, "You will not point at her again." The fourth shot took the badge with it and rang like a bell. Sheriff Harlan Pike fell as if learning to kneel too late. Judge Asa Hollis stepped back into his men and borrowed their fear. The town stared at the empty air where power had stood. Silence lay over Ash Mesa like a blanket that had seen too many winters. Cole Mercer said, "No badge, no lie to hide behind." Judge Asa Hollis said, "You shot a keeper of peace and summoned riot." Rosa Vale said, "You sold peace by the yard and cut it to fit graves." Hollis's guards formed a wall that shook at the edges. Old Tom Avery said, "Drop iron, boys, the day already chose its name." Lark Finch said, "The town heard the pages and wants the end read aloud." Cole Mercer said, "Read it for them, Rosa." She raised the letter and let Noon stamp every line. Rosa Vale said, "Warrants forged, water stolen, mercy priced and spent." Murmurs moved like a low river meeting rock. Judge Asa Hollis said, "These are slanders scratched by thieves." Cole Mercer said, "Then stand before your neighbors and call them thieves too." A ranch wife stepped forward and set her palm on the letter. Cole felt the town choose breath over fear. The square broke into shouting that tasted like rain before a storm. Judge Asa Hollis said, "Seize the traitors and burn the proof." Old Tom Avery said, "Try and you learn what old hands remember." Gunfire cracked and rang off the bank's stone face. Lark Finch said, "Cole, left flank." Cole Mercer said, "Hold low and breathe between thunder." Rosa Vale dragged a toppled barrel to shield the wounded. Old Tom Avery said, "I will flank their pride," and stepped into the open. He drew fire like a lighthouse calls ships and rocks both. Cole Mercer said, "Tom, back." Old Tom Avery said, "A debt rides best when it knows the road." The shot that found him sounded smaller than the world deserved. Lark Finch said, "Tom, stay with me." Old Tom Avery said, "Sight small, boy, and let the sky take his breath." The fight paused as if respect had pulled the trigger. They carried old Tom to the church steps where shade remembered gentler hours. Roosevelt said, I brought the fire that burned this far. Cole Mercer said, you brought light too, and light cuts both ways. Lark Finch said, Tom said to aim at the price, not the man. Roosevelt said, then we show the price, and make the man pay it. Judge Asa Hollis stood beneath the bell like a stain that would not scrub. Judge Asa Hollis said, give me the forgeries, and I commute your trespass. Cole Mercer said, you cannot commute a river back into a gate. Roosevelt stepped forward and faced the judge who once owned her name. Roosevelt said, I was Rosa Hollis, but I am Roosevelt by choice. Judge Asa Hollis said, you will starve without my shelter. Roosevelt said, I will starve honest and be fed by morning. The bell rope stirred as if it approved. Cole felt the town lean toward her voice and away from fear. Hollis tried to leave by the alley where truth went to be edited. Judge Asa Hollis said, arrest the girl and break the boy. Lark Finch said, I am done breaking for others. He stepped between Rosa and the guards like a door built from scar and will. Cole Mercer said, stand tall and count the breath, not the guns. Lark Finch said, I count people now. The first guard rushed and met a shoulder that did not blink. The second guard aimed and found his hand slapped to wood. Roosevelt said, read the decree aloud, Lark. Lark Finch said, Article 4, forged signatures, water rights seized by fraud. The crowd repeated the words, until they sounded like a hymn with teeth. Judge Asa Hollis said, you mistake noise for law. Cole Mercer said, law that fears noise is only costume. Hollis saw no doors left, that opened inward. Evening washed the town and left edges clean where blood had dried. Cole Mercer, said old Tom, we carried it as far as our boots would go. Roosevelt said, tomorrow, we file this proof where ink can't be bought. Lark Finch said, we will mend the gate and leave it open. Judge Asa Hollis said, you think you won with paper and noise. Cole Mercer said, we won with neighbors who chose to see. Hollis tried the last weapon left to him, and found it was only his name. The deputy he pointed to shook his head and set the badge on a post. Roosevelt said, you taught me the price of silence, and I will not pay again. Lark Finch said, old Tom, I will cite small and live big. Cole Mercer said, I forgive what I can, and bury what I must. Night drew long and the bell did not ring. Cole stepped into the street, and let the dark weigh him light.